Minnesota prosecutors charge ICE agent, Wisconsin tax deal saga, taxpayers fund a Super Bowl push, America's talking, and lastly, Illinois in focus over the FOID lawsuit. This and more. Welcome to the Center Square Daily. Today is Wednesday, May 20th, 2026. I'm your host, Esther Wickham. Stay tuned later for an Illinois in focus segment with Greg Bishop. Starting off with Minnesota prosecutors and federal immigration officers are increasingly at odds following criminal charges filed against an ICE agent, Christian Castro, in connection with the January shooting during Operation Metro Surge in Minneapolis. Castro faces 4 counts of second-degree assault and 1 count of falsely reporting a crime stemming from a January 14th shooting of a Minneapolis man during a federal immigration operation known as Operation Metro Surge. Now, this large-scale federal immigration enforcement operation effort has brought thousands of agents to the Twin Cities earlier this year. An ICE spokesperson told the Center Square that this case is, quote, a political stunt. These actions by Minnesota sanctuary politicians are unlawful and nothing more than a political stunt. The men and women of ICE are entrusted with upholding the rule and are held to the highest standards of professionalism, integrity, and ethic conduct. Violations of the sacred sworn oath will not be tolerated. Now, the spokesperson has also said that the U.S. Attorney's Office is reviewing statements made under oath related to Castro's case and noted that the federal personnel could face disciplinary action if misconduct is found. Now, the operation has sparked, obviously, many protests across the Twin Cities and has increased scrutiny over local officials following several confrontations involving federal agents. Now, federal authorities initially alleged that officers involved in the January incident had been assaulted during the encounter, but prosecutors now dispute that account and say that parts of the original federal description of the event were inaccurate. The Castro case is obviously part of a broader review by Minnesota authorities into conducting during Operation Metro Surge. Prosecutors say they are reviewing more than a dozen additional incidences involving federal agents and have launched a public portal for residents to submit photos and videos connected to these investigations. Now, Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison released a statement backing the prosecution and said the state of Minnesota must uphold people accountable for violating the law and for harming Minnesotans. I support the filing of these charges. And what they're saying here is that these federal agents are not above the law and they'll take every step they can to hold them accountable. We'll continue to follow this story and more. You can go to thecentersquare.com to see the developments of what goes out in the state of Minnesota. Next, in the state of Wisconsin, political leaders have been sharply divided over a tax deal saga and how to handle the state's projected budget surplus, and that disagreement became the central reason a major bipartisan tax and spending deal collapsed in the Senate. Here to tell us a lot more about it, we have the Center Square's reporter, John Stife. John, thanks so much for joining us today. Now, Wisconsin seems to be having this tax deal saga. It's been happening for the past couple of weeks and months. Tell us a little bit more about what has been going on here.
So the governor would love to give this. He's the former head of K-12 education in the state. He'd love to give a lot of that excess to the schools in the state. Part of the deal that they reached with the Republicans in the legislature was to give $300 million for special education to the state schools, give $300 million to the general school aid fund, which would replace property taxes for that same thing. And checks would be sent back to people based on their 2024 taxes. It would be $300 for individuals, $600 for those jointly filing. So the two heads of the Wisconsin legislature, both Republicans and the Democratic governor, came to an agreement on this deal. They thought it would go through. It went to the Assembly first. The Assembly passed it, but it got to the Senate, and there were 3 dissenting Republicans, and all the Democrats voted against it, so it failed in the Senate. Now, some of those Republican lawmakers in the assembly want another vote on it. They think they can change it enough that they can get the votes, either Democratic votes in the Senate or those 3 Republican votes they were looking for. Those 3 Republicans there in the Senate actually wanted larger refund checks and didn't want to have the spending added to it.
So these leaders, couldn't agree. It seems like it's a bipartisan disagreement here. You said many Democrats voted against it, and we have some Republicans dissenting. What were some of the comments that were made for why they didn't support it? Is it because they want extra changes, like you were saying, or is it a little bit more than that?
Well, an interesting part of this is the governor and the 2 legislative leaders are not running for re-election. And the governor kind of had disagreement with the Democrats in the legislature, both in the assembly and in the Senate, because none of the Democrats voted for the deal. And he's a Democrat. He didn't bring them in on the discussions enough, some of them said. Others said, hey, we're creating a structural deficit at the beginning of the next budgetary period if we send these checks back and we spend all this money. And understandably, like, several of those Democratic legislators are running for governor this next time. Part of the thought of that is, well, they'd rather spend the money than have it spent for them before they're elected.
Yeah, so with that governor's race up ahead, what are some of the implications this is going to have for Wisconsin residents, for taxpayers, if this tax deal saga continues and there's not really a solution resulting?
Well, Wisconsin does 2-year budgeting, so they didn't do a budget this year, but they'll have one next year under the new legislature and the new whoever's the new governor, whether it be Republican Tom Tiffany or any of a number of Democrats running. And so this will be a key point. If it's not resolved next year, it will be a key point in those budget negotiations next time around. And they'll be sitting on a lot of money where they can either spend it or they can give it back to taxpayers. That's kind of the legacy that the Republican legislative leaders wanted to have was, hey, we sent checks to you because we collect too much in taxes.
Yeah, and like you said, Governor Tony Evers kind of was upset about, this deal not moving forward, but he, backed tax rebates, no tax on tips, like you said, more school funding. And as you reported, one of his highlights was that he thinks that this deal didn't pass because of another governor candidate running for Wisconsin. Do you think that's true? Do you think that other individuals, other lawmakers are kind of, playing a role into whether or not this deal moves forward on the Republican side?
Well, part of the problem is that there were promises made by people like Senate Majority Leader Devin LeMahieu for other people. Like, he can't speak. He can speak for the caucus in general, but he can't speak for every individual and how they're going to vote on everything. And the governor felt like he was told if these rebate checks were included, that all the Republicans in the Senate would vote for it and this thing was going to pass. So, hey, let's announce it. Let's push it forward. That's not what ultimately happened. And then Evers came back and complained and said, well, Tom Tiffany came out against it and he convinced these 3 senators that are Republicans to vote against it because, any number of conspiracy theories like, hey, Tom Tiffany wants to use this in the general election. He wants to say, hey, I'm going to give you that money back that the previous group of legislators didn't give you.
Yeah. So now what is next? What are the next steps for this now that it's kind of collapsed within the Senate? Is there going to be a new deal held, a new vote? What can taxpayers and those that live in Wisconsin expect from this?
Well, there's 2 options. One of them is that Governor Tony Evers calls another special session. They go through it again. I can't imagine he's going to do that without being 100% confident that they have the votes, because it was pretty embarrassing for some of the people. You could tell they were in session in the morning. The assembly was. They left by like 11 a.m. They said they were going to come back in session by 1. And we were sitting there. It was 8:30. It was 9 o'clock p.m. and nothing had happened. Then they came back into session. Devin LeMahieu looked noticeably upset and tired and all the things. You kind of knew that the Senate was going to vote against it just based upon looking at his face as the discussion began. It's extremely rare in Wisconsin for a bill to come up and then get voted down. Usually it dies well before that if they know they don't have the votes. So this was pretty embarrassing for some of those leaders to have to go there and then have this 18-15 vote where the measure doesn't pass and it can't even get to the governor when the governor's already promised, hey, in a couple days, maybe next week, I'm going to sign this.
Yeah, it's definitely a tax steal saga, so we'll be keeping an eye on it. You go to thecentersquare.com to follow the developments there. But John, before you leave, I wanted to completely transition to a totally different subject. What is going on in Tennessee? It's looked like they have landed a deal for Super Bowl 64. A lot of taxpayer money involved. What's going on with the special event in Nashville for 2030?
So Tennessee lawmakers went all in to build a new stadium in Nashville. And part of that was on the promise, hey, eventually we're going to get a Super Bowl here. The legislature and governor gave $500 million of state money to it, and then $760 million in a tax capture. They're bonding that money, and ultimately that's going to be a tax capture around the stadium. So they'll spend $3.1 billion over the lifetime of this new stadium to pay back those bonds, maintenance, upkeep, all those things on this stadium. And it was all on the promise that, hey, we're going to have big events here. We're going to bring a Super Bowl here. Well, yesterday they landed the Super Bowl. They're going to have the 2030 Super Bowl in Nashville. Today there was a press conference. All the lawmakers are excited, but there's a lot of taxpayer spending involved in this, including $10.8 million from a special events fund that Tennessee created for things just like this. And you might be asking yourself, what are they spending that $10.8 million on? Well, wouldn't we all like to know? But the problem is, in 2024, Tennessee lawmakers passed a bill that said, we're not going to release what we're spending this money on for 10 years after it happens. So check back in 2040, you can get the details. One of the things that happened was 10 years ago when Minneapolis held one, the NFL contract for the Super Bowl ultimately came out through a public records request. And it was pretty embarrassing for the NFL because they asked for all these things like the presidential suites for free in every hotel in town, 25 to 30,000 free parking spots in town. If you've been to Minneapolis, that's a lot of parking spots in a small area around this stadium. They asked for police escorts for all these NFL officials. They asked for months of free golf at all the golf courses in the area. It's kind of like when famous musicians come to town and they have this list of things that they need to have backstage before a concert. Well, the NFL does that, but it's like on steroids, like times 100, times 1,000. That's what the NFL asked for a Super Bowl. And ultimately they say, well, it's going to benefit you a ton. And they give these huge numbers on, oh, here's the economic benefit for your town. Nashville's going to win big on this. But economists have actually studied this pretty intricately. They look at all the details. They use economic principles. And what they say is a Super Bowl brings maybe $30 to $130 million in extra economic activity. If you remember those billions I said before, those billions are a lot more than that potential $130 million it's going to bring in. So the taxpayer expense on these is always way more than the taxpayer benefit.
So the taxpayers are essentially going to be funding NFL perks, all of these benefits. Additionally, it looks like the funding is going to go towards a new Nissan stadium. How do you think Tennesseans are going to react to this, especially with the state showing that, yes, this investment is worth it? You kind of talked about it already, but, there doesn't seem like there's going to be a huge return on investment aside from, hey, we had the Super Bowl in our state.
So there's people that love the NFL that think, oh, this is a really great thing. This means we're a big time city. This means that, I get this great event coming. When they're saying that, they're not thinking of the thousands they'll actually have to pay to be able to go to the game themselves. A lot of times you're priced out. I mean, it's anywhere from $6,000 to $10,000 just for one ticket to one seat at these events. And there's some backlash from regular taxpayers, people that maybe don't care about the NFL. And that was actually addressed at the press conference today. Bill Haslam, who happens to own the NHL's Predators in Nashville as well. He said, well, that's why we bring in state tax money, sales tax money, and that helps pay for all the other things that everybody else wants. But again, that sales tax number is not going to be anything compared to the taxpayer cost of this. And that's why those presenting it try to present it as, oh, it's going to be way more. There's going to be this huge benefit. And they try to have that be the word that gets out instead of the reality that taxpayers are footing the bill for all these things for the NFL.
Yeah, $10.8 million in taxpayer funding. We'll stay tuned in 4 years to see how that fares for the state of Tennessee and for Tennesseans. Center Square's John Stife, thanks so much for joining us. Greatly appreciate it. To follow the latest in what's going on with Wisconsin and in the state of Tennessee, you can go to thecentersquare.com for more content. Next, quick hits from America's Talking with headlines from across America. If you would like to read more of these stories, the articles will be linked in the description below. Starting off with the state of New York. A federal judge blocked most courthouse arrests by U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement at New York City immigration courts, siding with a lawsuit by the American Civil Liberties Union after finding the policy was misapplied, while the U.S. Department of Homeland Security said it will appeal. Next, in the state of California, a California bill reported by our investigative team is to void secrecy agreements on the $1.1 billion California Capitol Annex project is set to die without a hearing, highlighting concerns from lawmakers and transparency advocates that widespread non-disclosure agreements are preventing public oversight, budget accountability, and scrutiny of potential cost outruns. Next, in the state of Georgia, Georgia's primary election ended with multiple key races heading to runoffs, including the governor's contest between Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones and businessman Rick Jackson, alongside other runoff battles for Lieutenant Governor, Secretary of State, and Education and Legal offices. While races like Attorney General were already decided, with State Senator Brian Strickland advancing to the general election after defeating rival Bill Cousert. Finally, out of the national website, we have former employees of Spirit Airlines. They have filed a class action lawsuit alleging mass layoffs during its bankruptcy restructuring, violating Federal WARN Act requirements by failing to provide 60 days notice, seeking payback and benefits for thousands of workers affected by the company shutdown and the wind down process. All these stories and more can be found at thecentersquare.com. Finally, Illinois in Focus segment, we have the Center Square's Greg Bishop, who spoke with New Civil Liberties Alliance Senior Litigation Counsel Jacob Hubert this morning. Take a look.
And now to talk about some of the latest in the legal battles over gun control in the state of Illinois, here for the Center Square Daily. It's Illinois in Focus, and I'm your host, Greg Bishop. Let's talk with Jacob Hubert, a counsel with the New Civil Liberties Alliance. Jacob, the firearm owner's ID card in Illinois has been around since the 60s. It requires everybody who wants to not just own, but purchase firearms and ammunition to have a card issued by Illinois State Police. It's been challenged in the past, but your organization, the New Civil Liberties Alliance, filing a federal lawsuit Tuesday. Tell us why this is significant.
Well, as you say, this has been on the books for decades, and it's a really extreme outlier among state laws regulating the right to possess a firearm. Illinois enacted this law in 1967. Massachusetts enacted a similar law in 1968. And no other state since then has gone so far in saying that you need the government's permission before you can so much as touch a gun in this state. And people have been decrying this as a violation of Second Amendment rights all along. But nobody until now, to my knowledge, has brought a federal lawsuit like this one, asking the courts to strike it down because it violates not only the Second Amendment, but also your right not to be deprived of your liberty without due process of law. To get the FOID card, they make you go to the Illinois State Police and go through an administrative procedure where the burden is on you the whole way to show that you're qualified to exercise this constitutional right, to satisfy them that you're allowed to do this. And that's just the opposite of how constitutional rights are supposed to work, of course. The whole point of a right is that you don't need the government's permission to do the thing. And yet Illinois makes you go through all of this, which could take months. Even if you go to court, the burden is still on you there. A court has no deadline by which it has to rule on this. And constitutional rights aren't supposed to be like that. You're supposed to be able to just exercise them. So we're hoping that the courts will finally end this now that we're squarely giving them this opportunity.
Now, Jacob, listeners, watchers, they're familiar with the Second Amendment. I could recite it for you. A well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But what about the 14th Amendment? Explain that to those who may not be constitutional attorneys. Why is that significant in this question of, is a government-issued ID to exercise a right constitutional?
So the 14th Amendment says, among other things, that no person can be deprived of liberty without due process of law. At the time the Constitution was enacted, that meant nobody could be deprived of liberty unless the government goes to court and shows why that person should be deprived of liberty to a neutral judge. And the courts have gotten a little bit looser on that over the years as far as how much process you get and who has to give it to you and all that. But this is way beyond the pale, because here you're just automatically deprived of your liberty until you go satisfy government officials in the executive branch that you're entitled to exercise your constitutional rights. You know, if we didn't have the FOID law and somebody owned firearms and the government wanted to take them away, well, the government would have to go to a court and tell a judge why this person's gun should be taken away because they're dangerous for some reason. Illinois reverses that and puts you in a guilty until proven innocent situation, which is the exact opposite of due process. And that's an angle that other people haven't brought forward, but that's very important to us at the New Civil Liberties Alliance and should be compelling to the courts.
And you mentioned other cases that have been brought. We've seen the Illinois Supreme Court and state courts hear this challenge about the FOID card in several different venues, being one in particular, an elderly woman had a rifle in her home, and police were called to the scene after a domestic incident and found the rifle. She did not have a FOID card and was charged with a crime. And obviously that case, I think, has bounced up to the Supreme Court in Illinois now like 2 or 3 times. But this is a federal case. And if you could, tell us about the plaintiffs. There's 3 of them, and they all kind of have unique positions that they're bringing forward. Tell us about that.
Well, 2 of our plaintiffs, Christopher Laurent and Kim Dalton, would like to own a firearm, but they object in principle to this idea that they have to go ask the government's permission, and they refuse to even do it. They say we shouldn't have to go beg the government permission to exercise our rights, and we're not going to do that. They're not breaking the law in the meantime, but they're not going to do that. And so they say they should just be allowed to go get the firearm, to have self-defense in their home, and that's what they're asking for from the court, that they can just exercise that right in the same way that people in 48 other states get to exercise it, where they don't need to go get this permit first. Our other plaintiff, Justin Tucker, did get the FOID card. He applied for it in the summer of 2020 when things were getting pretty out of hand in the city of Chicago. And he thought, oh, maybe it'd be a good idea for me to have a firearm for self-defense in my home. And so he applied for the FOID card then. It took them 9 months to get it to him, but he does have it now. But there's still problems. One problem is the law says not only do you need to apply for and be issued the FOID card, but you have to have it on you at any time that you possess a firearm. And he objects to that. You know, that's a situation where essentially the government can ask you for your papers to see if you are someone entitled to exercise a right. And that, too, is not how rights are supposed to work in this country. And then the license expires after 10 years, and he doesn't want to have to renew it. He doesn't want to have to go through that again because he has the same objection as the other plaintiffs, that he should not have to ask the government's permission. And, our client, Christopher Laurent, he's a Navy veteran. He is trained in firearms, has special certifications in firearms. No question, this is a law-abiding citizen, knows what he's doing with the firearm. Someone like this should, or like everybody else who hasn't actually done something wrong, should just be able to exercise their constitutional rights.
We're talking with Jacob Huberts with the New Civil Liberties Alliance for the Center Square Daily. And you had mentioned it took one of your clients about 9 months to get that FOID card approved. And that was around the time I remember covering this at the State House, Jacob. There were people coming up to me saying it's been more than a year since my renewal application's gone through. And state law prescribes a specific amount of time for applications to be accepted or denied, and it's like 30 to 60 days or something. Pretty remarkable. We didn't see a flood of lawsuits at that time. But what about this particular case do you think will be successful? And are you guys planning to go all the way up the federal judiciary to the U.S. Supreme Court if necessary?
Well, one reason why we should be successful now is because the Supreme Court in the Bruin decision a few years ago gave courts very clear guidance on how to analyze a Second Amendment challenge. The Supreme Court said, well, you look at, does this restrict the right as reflected in the text of the Second Amendment? And if so, was this kind of restriction something that was considered acceptable regulation of firearms at the time of the founding? Was something analogous done at the time of the founding so that it was understood that even though you have the right, the government could do this thing? And here, well, certainly, of course, the FOID card requirement affects the right in the Constitution. It totally denies everyone the right to keep and bear arms completely unless until they get this card. And so then we look at, are there any historical analogs? Was there anything like what Illinois is doing at the time of the founding? And of course there wasn't. Illinois enacted this law in 1967, and it was the first law of its kind anywhere in the country for the country's entire history. There was never anything that required somebody to go get the government's permission before owning any firearm in the founding era. So if the courts just apply that in a straightforward way, it should fail under the Second Amendment. Then you also have this due process argument, which also should be very difficult for the government to overcome. So we're optimistic about that. And, of course, no matter who wins and loses in the district court, no doubt it will be appealed to the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals. And no doubt if the government loses in the Seventh Circuit, it would probably want to take it up to the Supreme Court. And we would be thinking very seriously about that as well if it comes the other way. Hopefully that won't be necessary. It'd be great if we could just win at the district court and Illinois gives up. But unfortunately, they tend to defend their firearms restrictions to the hilt. And so we will have to challenge them all the way as well if they keep doing that.
Jacob, having covered the issue of gun control and litigation against gun control and legislation for more gun control, I want to get your thoughts here about the supporters of a FOID law or supporters of other types of gun control laws. They talk about unprecedented societal concerns. They talk about, self-harm that children may do if there's a proliferation of firearms. They raise a variety of different concerns about violence and inner city violence and things like this. What's your response to that?
Well, 48 other states managed to protect the public safety without anything like this FOID card requirement. So certainly you don't need a FOID card requirement to protect public safety pretty well. I mean, there's plenty of other states that protect public safety better than Illinois and the city of Chicago seem to do without any requirement like this. And yes, of course, there's always the risk that someone will do something bad with a firearm. But of course, criminals, the kind of people who want to go commit crimes, are probably not the kind of people who remember to ask the government's permission before they get the gun to commit their crime. The bigger effect here is, of course, on law-abiding people who are going to follow whatever the law is and either go get the FOID card, apply for that before they get a firearm, or like two of our plaintiffs, just not bother to get a firearm at all because they don't want to go through this process. So there's no reason to think that this law is preventing much crime, but it is preventing people from exercising their rights. And, of course, there are always public safety concerns around guns, but the Supreme Court has said very clearly that the Second Amendment made that choice for this country, that we think it's better for people to have the right to keep and bear arms. And Illinois doesn't get to second guess that as it has with the FOID card requirement.
Well, Jacob Hubert with the New Civil Liberties Alliance, a new lawsuit filed in federal court against Illinois' firearm owner identification card. We'll definitely be staying on top of that. Greatly appreciate you taking the time with the Center Square Daily.
Well, from my studio here in Southern California, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll be back with more stories like this tomorrow on Thursday, looking at more stories that impact you, the taxpayer. I'm your host, Esther Wickham. This is the Center Square Daily.